Thanks very much, Vanessa. When I opened the conference, I mentioned that the conference has been organised by the Australian Institute of International Affairs and the Southeast Asia Institute here at ANU. I should also have acknowledged that we're very grateful to the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade for also providing support, particularly for providing support for our visitors, for our speakers from Indonesia. So it's been one of the things that makes it possible for this conference to take place, not just hearing Australian voices, but hearing voices directly from Indonesia. So we're very grateful to DFAT for its support. Now, ladies and gentlemen, what you're going to experience in this day is going to be something a little bit like Kurosawa's famous film Rashomon. Those of you most people have seen it, but if you haven't, it's the story. In fact, it's several stories about a murder told in, well, not quite in a construction site, but in a ruined city gate where different witnesses tell what they saw of the murder. Some of the details are shared, some of them are directly contradictory. You're going to hear from academics, from witnesses, and no doubt also from members of the audience, a number of very different views of what took place. Now for me, one of the really interesting issues about examining 1965 is to ask, why are there so many theories? Why can we quickly run off 4, 5, 6 different plausible theories about what took place? There are 3 answers to that question. The first is that the evidence is so fragmentary. The fragmentary nature of the evidence, the incomplete nature of the evidence points to the likelihood that what took place was what we can call a deep conspiracy. Now, conspiracies operate at 3 levels. There are straightforward conspiracies, normal conspiracies. We just saw one in Canberra a couple of days ago. It happens in secret, but as soon as the results are known, we get the inside story, because there's no premium in keeping the inside story secret. Deep conspiracies are different. In deep conspiracies, what takes place on the surface is not the whole story. Behind those who do the plotting, there are other plotters whose identity needs to remain secret. So because we lack a lot of reliable detail about what took place in Jakarta in September, October 1965, there's a high degree of likelihood that the information is being concealed and that we're talking about a manipulative coup. We're talking about a coup by Lieutenant Colonel Untung, which had a dalang. Now, who the dalang may have been is another question, but it's likely that we're talking about a deep conspiracy. The second reason why there are so many theories is that the political implications of the conclusions that we draw are far-reaching. If the PKI was indeed responsible for the coup, then there is an implication that everything that followed was politically justified, that Suharto came to power with justification, that his suppression of the Communist Party was also justified, that the PKI was, in what was an ancient, or rather old term in Indonesian historical analysis, kalah dan salah, losing and wrong. If, on the other hand, the PKI was innocent, then the events that followed take on the character of a massive crime against Indonesian politics and a massive crime against humanity. So the political implications mean that people are very heavily invested in the variety of theories. Third reason why there are so many theories is something that is also characteristic of conspiracy, and that is that where the political circumstances lead to one conspiracy, you can be almost certain that there is more than one conspiracy. If circumstances are fraught, if procedures are unreliable, if outcomes, if a great deal is riding on the outcomes, then there's never just one group of people who are plotting. There's always more than one. Often there's several different groups who are plotting. And this is almost certainly the case in Indonesia in 1965. It has major implications. It has major implications for the way we work to investigate what took place, because it means that there is likely to be evidence that is relevant to more than one of those conspiracies. We can imagine when we're dealing with 1965, we have a bag full of jigsaw pieces. We spread them out on the floor. We're trying to fit them all together into the one picture. There's not enough to make the jigsaw puzzle, but we try and set them out on the floor. We stand back and we try to get the big picture. The problem is that in that bag of jigsaw pieces, there's actually pieces from more than one jigsaw puzzle. There's pieces from 2 or 3 or 4 puzzles. 2 or 3 or 4 plots were probably underway at this time, and we cannot be certain as we deal with those jigsaw pieces just which puzzle any one of them come from. So with that starting point, I want to go back to the morning of the 1st of October, the announcement from Radio Republik Indonesia that a group of army officers had taken action to forestall a coup by the generals, which they expected would take place a few days later, as David said, on Armed Forces Day, 5th of October. Now, what did people think when they heard that announcement? Very, very difficult in retrospect to ask people to get any kind of... When we do oral history, some kinds of memory are relatively reliable, others simply can't be trusted. Asking people what they thought at a particular moment is very difficult. But there was an American researcher in Jakarta at the time, Roger Paget, who went around and asked people what they thought had happened. And what he heard was that everyone thought that this was the PKI's coup. 6 generals had been kidnapped. Very quickly it was clear that it had been a violent kidnapping. Whether they were alive or dead was not yet certain, but there were bloodstains on the floor. There had been shooting. It was clearly not just an amicable discussion about what might happen on the next at the next meeting of the Council of Generals. This was a violent affair. People in Jakarta, people across Indonesia, believed that this was the PKI's strike. And they believed that because of the nature of Indonesian politics at the time. The PKI, an old element in Indonesian politics, it had been a major contributor to Indonesian political thinking. It had contributed leaders to Indonesia since the 1920s. It was the largest communist party that was not in power, the 3rd largest communist party in the world. It looked like a contender for political power in Indonesia. But, as David suggested, it looked vulnerable because it didn't yet have weapons. It didn't have its hands on the levers of power. It looked very, very plausible that the Communist Party would act to nudge Indonesian politics in a leftward direction, to make it more difficult, perhaps impossible, for the army to stand in its way. Now, why did the army stand in its way? The army stood against the Indonesian Communist Party partly for historical reasons. The party and the army had fought a short but bitter and brutal civil war in 1948. Many senior officers had been young officers at the time, and they still felt bitter about what they regarded as the PKI's brutality, its betrayal of Indonesia at that time. The army also had all sorts of interests. It had economic interests, it had administrative interests which were threatened by the party. The army, the officer corps of the army, could not afford to have the Communist Party come to power. those two forces looked like the future shape of Indonesia. But in the middle, there was Sukarno, President Sukarno, a charismatic leader who had done a great deal to shape Indonesia's national identity, who had spent his life trying to weld disparate Indonesians together to make a single national identity. Sometimes when we read about 1965, we read about Sukarno being the pivot in a kind of triangular relationship between Sukarno, the president, the party, and the army. It wasn't just Sukarno. Sukarno was surrounded by people who called themselves Sukarnoists, who believed in Sukarno's inclusive but radical vision for the kind of future that Indonesia would be. But as Sukarno faltered, it began to look increasingly likely that there would be no Sukarnoist future for Indonesia, that it would be either the army or the party. Now, we will possibly never know, perhaps the archives will come open one day, but possibly we'll never know whether Yani and the generals really were planning a coup for the 5th of October. But we do know now that Dian Aidit, as leader of the Communist Party, had a plan. And his plan was to conceal the PKI's involvement in an event which would throw the army off balance. The generals would be kidnapped, they would be taken out of the political equation for the moment, and in that time, new institutions would be created in which the right wing would be marginalised. Aidit believed that Indonesian politics was, broadly speaking, was ready for that kind of shift. He was also absolutely convinced, it appears, that Jakarta was where it was going to happen. Remember that the Indonesian Communist Party had abandoned the idea of revolution in the countryside. It had abandoned coming to power in a march on Jakarta. That was significant for its own policies. It was also significant for its judgment of the nature of its enemies. It didn't matter from the PKI point of view if there was an obstreperous general in Makassar or an obstreperous general in Palembang. They weren't going to be able to change things. What mattered was what happened in Jakarta. And we now know, thanks to the research of John Rusa and a young scholar, Tamo Zhou, who's been in the Chinese archives, we now know that Aidit was planning during the course of 1965 to have junior army officers stage this action against the army high command. In August 1945, Aidit informed his friend Mao Zedong in Beijing that this is what he had in mind. So Untung's desire to protect his president was no doubt sincere, but in many respects we can regard him as Aidit's stooge for the event. And Aidit's miscalculation brought catastrophe on himself and on his party, because he evidently assumed that the blow against the army high command would be enough to throw the army off balance. He hadn't counted on Suharto reacting effectively, and as soon as Suharto had in fact taken charge of the army, it was clear that the PKI could not come to power. There would be no way in which the PKI could move from its position of ideological, political dominance to coming to power. And Aidit appears to have wanted to blame that Jakarta coup on Untung. He stayed in the background. That intention was thwarted by the fact that everyone knew that the PKI they knew without evidence that the PKI must have been behind it. Aidit's secretiveness, in a sense, was completely in vain, because without evidence, the conclusion was obvious to all at the time that the party was involved. We need to remember also that the killing of 6 generals was a dramatic blow in Indonesian politics. There had been no political assassinations in Indonesia since the revolution, since the turmoil of the revolution. This was an action which went far beyond the savage rhetoric of politics during guided democracy. But what happened then was that the Suharto group piled onto that dramatic action two entirely false stories. One was the false story that the generals had been sexually mutilated and tortured by young communist women. And the second, much more far-reaching, was that the whole Communist Party had in fact been involved in a massive conspiracy, that the killing of the generals was only the first step in a massive plan involving all communists in Indonesia to kill their neighbours and to seize power. So we need to make a very sharp distinction between what now appears to be the proven involvement of IDIT and of just a handful of his colleagues, and the subsequent allegation, the false allegation by the Suharto group that the Communist Party as a whole had been involved in the events. This false allegation created a sense of, it turned hostility, it turned political antagonism into hatred and detestation, contempt and fear, which underpinned the populist aspects of the killings that followed. We now know that the army played a very significant role in managing the killings, but there was also a very strong populist element in those killings that was created by this entirely false image that the PKI as a whole had been planning a coup. Nonetheless, so we have treated the 1965 as a whodunit, as a mystery, with a cast of kind of Agatha Christie short story with a cast of suspects. It seems to me that actually we have largely solved that whodunit, but there are two intriguing mysteries that remain, and they're very important for the way in which we understand what took place. First is, did IDIT have real knowledge of a general's coup to take place later in October? Was he simply speculating that this was likely? Or was he deceived in an intelligence operation that was designed to provoke him into action? We know that Western intelligence agencies were despairing of the possibility that the PKI might slide into power in Indonesia as a consequence of the decline of Suharto, the decline of Sukarno, and that many intelligence agencies hoped that the PKI would provide an excuse, a pretext. Well, we can actually hope that one day the intelligence files will be open. The only problem is that we will probably, all of us, be dead by then, so we're not likely to find out. My own feeling is that guided democracy was such a pungent stew of rumours. You can see how easy it is to generate rumours. We had, from my esteemed colleague David Reeve, two plausible, entirely plausible, but completely false rumours just inserted into our discourse. I'm not actually very good at spotting poltergeists wandering around the corridors of Parliament House, and it's not well known that Vanessa is completely fluent in Swedish, so she knows how to pronounce Hammarskjöld. I just inserted another false rumour into the discourse. So we don't actually need Western intelligence agencies to explain why IDIT may have launched the coup. We can be sure that they were fishing in the troubled waters, but we can't be sure that they were decisive. Second crucial question is, what did Suharto know before the morning of the 1st of October? It seems to me that the fact that he wasn't amongst the generals who were kidnapped is not significant, because he wasn't known as a political general. if generals of his calibre had been tackled, then there would have been many more on the list. I don't take seriously either the argument that he moved too effectively on the morning of 1st of October, that he must have had prior warning in order to be so effective. Soldiers are, after all, meant to respond to unexpected circumstances. And yet another rule of conspiracy is that conspiracies are very difficult rather, to organise. They're very difficult to make succeed because planning in secret is so difficult. And the vast majority of conspiracies fail. Those who benefit from conspiracies are not those who plot them, but those who respond. And they can respond because they don't have a prior plan to be disrupted. So it's perfectly predictable that someone like Suharto would react effectively after the conspiracy. But Suharto met Abdul Latif a few hours before the coup, before the kidnapping of the generals. What happened? So, according to Latif himself, he told Suharto that action was underway, and according to Latif in his trial, so some doubt over the trial, of course, having reported to him, I obtained moral support because there wasn't any reaction from him. How very much like Suharto that is, we know from all the other circumstances. He kept his cards very close to his chest, waited until the last moment, and then moved decisively. So it probably wasn't clear to Suharto what he could or should be doing at the time, but probably he was indeed prepared when the news broke on the morning of 1st of October that it was going to be important to do something. There's another rule of conspiracy, and that is that conspiracies succeed normally when they confirm existing trends. It's very unusual for conspiracies to change the course of history. They change the course of history for people who are their immediate victims. People die. That's a pretty dramatic change to the course of your personal history. But in broader terms, conspiracies rarely change overall trends. They simply accelerate, they confirm overall trends. The fact that the coup organised by IDIT failed is not surprising. The PKI was very unlikely, it was not in a position to come to power. The army, by contrast, was well organised, it had international support, it was determined, it had weapons. And some kind of a transition to military rule in Indonesia after 1965, it seems to me, was almost certain. If we imagine what a PKI government might have been, just imagine if IDIT had come to power. Imagine trying to rule Indonesia as a communist government. Consider the scale of Islamic hostility to communism. It's very hard to imagine the practicalities, the nuts and bolts of a communist government in Indonesia. A communist government in Indonesia, it seems to me, was extremely unlikely. And it's all the more tragic then that the coup provided the pretext for the murder of 500,000 people. Thank you.